That's good. Cool. We're going to be talking about web development and the basics of it. So this is going to assume minimal programming experience, although there is going to be a bit of bravery involved with tackling new concepts. Let's go over what's on the menu today. There is what is web development, what constitutes a web developer, and the three core tenets of web development, at least the front end. Then we'll get to our CrossyRoad clone and modify it so that we use our skills that we talked about in topic 2. And finally, I'll talk about how you can learn more. Because if you want to really get into web dev, the best way is to really just learn about the various things in modern web development and continuously code and make new things. So let's talk about the front end and back end. Today's focus is on the front end. We may have a future workshop on the back end, but the front end is basically what the user sees. Now, it's our job, or well, a web developer's job, to make it as nice as possible for a user. Now, the back end deals with more complicated machinery. If it's some really intense task, so you may have seen websites that create really pretty images, and let me tell you, most of the time, the front end won't be doing that work. It tells the back end, okay, create this image for me. And that back end has the machinery to do all of that. Hence this description here, this image here, which shows how complicated web dev backend stuff can really get. Some of the words you may have heard about both sides of front end and back end. I'll talk a bit about these. So the first three things you've seen here, React, Vue, and Angular, are JavaScript frameworks. They are used to build on top of existing bits of JavaScript, and they make web development easier. The CSS and jQuery, so CSS is what we'll talk about later. jQuery is another thing you'll see down the line. As for backend, you have a lot of things. You have the server, which is one type of option is Nginx, or how, as it's said, Nginx there, SQL and MongoDB, which are databases, and you have a variety of languages that can be backends. I recommend following the Notion guides. So if I open this up, I have attached a variety of links on how these things work. Now, okay, so here's the thing. I have put WebAssembly in backend, although it really should be in front end. I'll talk about that at the end. So there are lots of links down here, down at the end, for you to look at after this. Okay, so when it comes to web development, there are three primary factors. HTML, which is hypertext markup language, which is a basic way of saying this is the structure of a page. And you could liken it to the bones of your body. Then you have your CSS. Those are your cascading style sheets. That's effectively your skin. And it's like a coat of paint on top of your HTML. Otherwise, it looks very raw and really ugly without it. Finally, you have the JavaScript, which I like to think of as nervous system. It's basically the interactivity. It's how you move your body. But in this case, when the web page does something, it reacts accordingly. So if you want interactive buttons that do things when you click on them, JavaScript is what you look at there. So we're going to get back to this later. Now let's open up VS Code. We're going to go off the tutorial here, assuming you have a code editor. And if you don't, you can set up a VS Code right now and follow the tutorial later. The template code is available here. If you click on this, it will download it for you. I already have it downloaded. And okay, let's open it up. I have this file here. It might be a bit small, so let me know. There's these files, except for the zip file, that should be in your repository. Ignore this Git file. I'll probably mention that later. So we'll open this up in our code editor. Actually, specifically, I want to open up this demo folder here. We'll be working off a blank file to begin with. Okay, so how do you create a basic HTML file? How do you create a basic web page? I'll be opening up Chrome for this. It'll be useful to have on the side. And whenever I open the HTML file, in this case, it opens with Firefox, but I'm going to open it in Chrome. There's nothing on the page because I haven't put anything in my file yet. So to add stuff to the bone of our page, the first thing we want to do is declare that our file is a HTML file. So that's just there because it has to be. Then we have the header. This basically just has metadata, which is basically information about the page. Now, I'll get to that in a bit, but we can leave it blank for now. It's not doing too much. Then we get to our body. Okay, so as you can see, let's see if it's, I think it's a bit small right now. So I'll zoom in. I think that's better. Yeah. So this is the body, basically the chunk or the meat of our page. It goes inside here, whatever the blank bit of the screen is. And you can then write something like P. Now, if I go back to when I was typing this, it says the P element represents a paragraph. So this is what you call a tag, a paragraph tag, and I want to say, hello there. If I refresh this, it gets me this hello there, but it's in the most bland format possible. It's not really pretty. It's a fixed size. I can't easily change it. So I need to actually specify a style for it. So we do this via the style sheet, which is our code of paints. Now, right now, there isn't any linking because when we talk about two things interacting with each other, they need to know that the other exists. So what I do here is I go back to my HTML file. And what I do is I write link. This creates a link to another resource. And I'm going to say rel is a style sheet. And I could close it, but I need to specify where it is from. So here, when I do the /, it's actually looking at the directory that the index file is in. Now, our CSS file has been linked to our HTML file, but there's not going to be any differences. This is because I haven't specified anything in our styling. Let's add a title to this thing. So H1, we'll call it, this is a title. And this is a tag just saying, okay, create text with the section heading of the largest size. Okay, this won't change anything. You have this really ugly font here that I don't really like. So how do we style these particular tags? When I go into my CSS file, I can write H1. So I'm saying, okay, for the style of H1, I want to say, let's set the font family. So that's the font. And I say colon, and it gives me options here. So this is a VS Code thing. And that's why I really recommend using VS Code for it. And I close this off with a semicolon like this. If I refresh the page, you see that the title font instantly changes. Great. And I can also change the color. So I can do color. VS Code also does this nice stuff. I'll set it to be color. There we go. I can do a similar thing for P, the paragraph option. So I'll set the font family again, and I'll set it to be Korea New. If I refresh the page, it sets into the Korea New typewriter aesthetic. So we've got these two things interacting with each other. We have the CSS and the HTML. How do we incorporate the JavaScript? JavaScript changes stuff about both the CSS, our styling, and our HTML. Well, one thing I can do is inside the body, I want to say, okay, include a script. And I want to specify the sources. Once again, I use the /script.js. And it'll close up the tag. Nothing will happen at this point if I refresh the page. So we'll just get to that in a bit. Now, in order to illustrate this example, I'm going to add an item called a button. So this is really just what its name suggests. It's a button that you can click, and it has a very cool animation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it an ID. So these IDs are unique specifiers for your tags. And if I look, so if I do this, it says defines a unique identifier that must be unique in the whole document. This is for accessing the style of it in a unique way so that I don't style every other button the same way. So let's call this click. And just for good measure, I'll say click me here. I'll add another button just to drive the point home. If I refresh, you have two buttons, this big one and this small one. How do I style this click button here, but not this general button without anything in it? I use something new. I want to say, okay, for click. So for anything styled with click, anything with the tag click, that is, let's say the font family is, I'll just go with whatever the closest one is. And I want to change the background color to be red. We'll set it to be red. Now let's refresh the page. You can see that once again, the page changes automatically. Perfect. So just to recap what's going on, the HTML looks at the CSS and puts a code pane on it, basically. That's what's going on. And here, we've specified anything with this unique ID of click shall have these properties here. So make sure, make this a bit smaller. Okay. Yeah. So let's get to linking the script component of our file, our JavaScript component. One thing we can do is JavaScript can access the document of this thing, the whole document object model. So that's what we call the DOM. And it's basically a structured view of our HTML file. And it can modify, add elements, or remove elements from the file. So I've added more notes in the actual Notion doc about it. But for now, I'm just going to say const button. So in JavaScript, I should also mention this. There are three ways to define something with a value or variable: let, var, and const. I'm not going to talk about the differences here. I may mention it at the end, but const has a bit more going on with it. So what I'm going to do is there's this thing called document. And I want to say get element by ID, but I've given the button the ID of click. Okay, that's pretty cool. We have effectively a reference to our button that we're clicking here in our JavaScript file. And I'm going to add something. So I want it to react when I click on it. So there's this thing called an event listener. There's a lot of details here about what it is. Okay, I'm going to say the type of event is on a click. And now when I do this, there's a bit of stuff that requires a bit of explaining. But for now, you can kind of just work with it. Interpret this as, okay, if we're clicked on, do this. This is what you call a function. It doesn't look like the normal function, but we'll talk about it in a bit. Okay, so I want to get the button. And what I want to do with it is I want to set the style. So when we do .style, we are accessing, wait, hang on. Nope. This is incorrect. Okay, so we need to do this on 2 lines. This is a brief mistake. You can do it the way I was going towards, but it's a bit messy. But I also recommend doing this. So we're going to change this instead to be a document dot query selector. And we're going to query it by the same thing, hashtag click. And this time we're going to set the button background color to be green. And if everything is fine, so let's just go over what's going on here. From the document, which you can interpret to just be the HTML page, I want you to find things with the ID click. And it's a bit more involved with that. And then I afterwards want you to add onto all the things that have click on it to have this event listener and to set the background color to be green. So let's refresh our file. I think it's refreshed. If I click it, it changes the color. This is great. Now let's try to vary it up. If our button color, so if button.style, and now when I'm doing this square bracket index, I'm looking at the properties in here. So I'm just saying, okay, get the property of the background color, and it'll return red. So I'm going to say, if the background color is red, then I'm going to set it to be green. So we'll put the code in here, but otherwise I want to turn it back to be red. So I'm going to reset the color to be red. I'm going to copy this code here. Now, the distinction between the double equals and the single equals is this is really assignment. You're giving it a value, and this is comparison. You're checking if they're equal. This is a common salient point that goes unnoticed by people, but keep that in mind. So if I click on it, it will change color. Pretty cool. So we have successfully shown how all 3 components interact with each other. The HTML is your bare bones. The script or the JavaScript file will interact with both of them when it's being clicked on, and it does this by the HTML. So we have this reference to the HTML, and the CSS just provides the styling for it. So we have a basic understanding of how this sort of stuff works. Let's get into how we do this with CrossyRoad. Okay, and we go back to our parent directory. So go up a file, up a folder, and instead I'll close this and open this now. I'll clear the screen. Okay. This time there's a bit more going to this pre-built CrossyRoad file. In the index file, I'll just go over it quickly. We have this style sheet, once again, the same as what we did the first time. We have this counter. This is your score. And we have these things called divs. According to the reference, it has no special meaning. I interpret it as a division, but the easiest kind of way to interpret it is a box-like thing. Then we have these things that these are buttons here. So you won't see them at first, but we'll talk about why they don't appear at first. And you have this external source file. This is for our 3D rendering. So if I open up this file, open up Chrome, we can see CrossyRoad opens. Now, there's a few issues here. First off, we have an invisible element. This is our counter, so it's our score, and it's all white on a white background. So it's a bit of an issue. Additionally, we have no visible retry button. So that's not really an issue, but just something to notice. But you can see that another issue is that even after we die, we can still keep moving. We don't want this to happen, obviously. So let's go over what's going on in the script file real quickly. a lot of other stuff to do with rendering. So this 3D stuff is not easy, let me tell you. But there's a lot of resources for 3JS, the 3D rendering library. We'll be talking about how the JavaScript interacts with these objects. So how the cars move, how the chicken moves. So in the start, we have a reference to counter and end. And then afterwards, we have these camera specs. So this is just the camera perspective. If you look at the screen pretty carefully, you'll notice a lot of lighting effects as well. Then you have some properties about the board game. So not the board game, the game itself. You have these textures here. Then for each lane, so once again, these weird arrow-like functions appear. And then we have these generating lane functions. These basically generate these 3 types of lanes. So there's a truck lane, there's a car lane, and there's a forest lane. And it creates a texture or the mesh for it. So here's the lighting effect you can see. It's actually a bright screen. But if I was to turn off the hemisphere light, so if I remove the lighting effect, this will turn dark, which is a pretty cool thing. You can tinker around with various components of the file. Note that it may break very easily, but you will be able to notice what each of the lines of code do to the whole game, assuming it doesn't break, of course. The rest of this stuff here is shadow-related stuff. So if I reopen this page, you can see each object has a shadow on it. Then here, we have our initialize values. Okay, so each time you restart a game, you've got to put the bird back in place. You've got to reset the score. You also got to reset all the cars, and you've got to reset the lanes because you're not starting from the same position. And we'll do this each time you restart the game. Finally, there's the rendering stuff. I'm not going to talk too much about this because it's fairly involved, but each of these objects here are textures. So if I look into it, there's a lot of texture-related stuff going on. You just need to know that they're created each time they appear on the screen. Okay, I've added in some comments to make it easy for where you can add interactivity. An example of what I've done is a document query selector. So this is for the retry button. As you can see, the retry button doesn't appear immediately. It only appears when the bird gets run over, and then it appears. When I press the retry button, it vanishes once again. What's going on here is that the retry button's visibility goes back to being hidden. This is a really powerful thing to know, because if you can change the state or the visibility of your CSS, or specifically the styling of your object, then you can create much more interactive menus. Although this is kind of old, really there are newer frameworks that have better ways of adding content to your screen. Then we have our key presses. So we're acting on the window here. In effect, think of this as the browser passing in its variables. The window is adding a listener for a key press down. So this is holding down the key. I'm holding down the keyboard here, not pressing it down. And it just has the up, down, left, right arrows on them. Then we have this function for moving. This just modifies the lane that the chicken is in. And you can see that when you're next to a forest or below a forest, like a tile, you can't move past it. So that's the sort of checking you'd have to do, collision type check you'd have to do in order to assure that you can actually move in that direction. Finally, the animation. So there's a lot going on here. What's going on is that each instance, the canvas, so what you call the scene right now, requests a frame from this animate function, and it slowly, incrementally makes the bird move and these cars move. So each time you see the bird jump, it goes up in the air a bit, and then incrementally animates that bird going back down. One important thing we'll have to notice is that there is collision detection done here. So when we get hit by a truck or a car, we're doing a check here to see, okay, if our chicken is pretty close to a car, that is, it's literally inside it. So this is just to say, if our bird's inside the car, then I want to create option to show the retry button. That's why it appears. So we've set it to be visible. Great. Finally, let's just go over the CSS and point out some issues. First off, our body, that is everything inside here, will have the color white. This is a major issue because, as you can see, the screen is white, and you really shouldn't be having a white counter on top of that. So it's a bit of an issue. Additionally, we can import fonts like so. Sometimes you may not have them immediately accessible, and you may have to look online for fonts. And then our buttons here. So this is a black button. Well, it has a shadow of a black button. You can see kind of close if you look carefully that it has a shadow around it. Then for your retry button, it's initially invisible, but then when you get hit by something, it sets it to be visible. This end button is also red, has a specific padding, and when it says font families inherit, it's basically looking at the parent object. So this retry button here is contained within a body. Now, it will inherit this font family. That's why it has this retro-esque coloring, retro-esque font to it. The rest of this stuff down here is for slider stuff, and I'll get to that in a bit. We have 3 primary goals, so just open up. Okay, so we have 3 primary goals. 1, make it hot when you die, so you shouldn't keep moving when you get hit by something. 2, spruce up the CSS so it doesn't look as awful. And finally, I want to have a camera toggle. So I want this switch so that when I press it, it will change the camera perspective. Okay, let's get into goal 1. Make it halt when you die. I need to do this from the script file. The other 2 things don't handle interactivity. So I've already defined a variable called true here, but it's not in use. If I search up whether alive is being used anywhere, it's really just being used here at the start, where you're saying you're alive at the start of the thing, and here when you're initializing the game. So there's not much going on here, but let's think about this. The alive variable has to be modified at several points. 1, when you get hit by a truck and you die, you're no longer alive. 2, when you restart, you will have to be alive afterwards. And then finally, we have to check whether we're alive to keep on moving. First off, the alive check is not implemented, so we have to go down to our key press listener. So we're going to have to insert logic for whether we're alive. I'm going to say if alive, if it is true that we're alive, then all the code below, that is, I want to take all this code here, I want to copy it. I should be cutting it, don't copy it. And I want to put into here. So only on the condition that you're still alive, you will be allowed to move. Great. Final bit to modify is down here. And I want to say, if we get hit by something, we're no longer going to be alive. Okay. So we go all the way down to line 616, and then we insert a not alive anymore statement. Let's put this to action. Remember, you should always be testing your code after you write some updates to it. So let's see. In this case, if I get hit, I will die. I can't move. I'm pressing on the keyboard. Nothing's happening. If I retry, I can move again. Great. So this was a simple enough first goal, and it's kind of dipping your toes into the water. Our second goal is to spruce up the CSS. One thing I want to do is change this white background to a bluish background. So it's similar to the one that you see in the top of the screen for the actual document. So I go back to my CSS file. I want to specify the background color. I'll set it to be like this color. Okay, let's refresh the page. That's a pretty cool color. It's made the CSS, it's actually made the counter now visible because before it was white and now it's on a blue background. I'll actually change this to be aqua. I like the color aqua better. Okay, so we've done half the job, but I want to instead change this counter icon here. I don't want it to be black. I don't want it to be white, sorry. I want it to be black. That's a better color here to contrast against. So I will specify that I want to change the option for the counter. First off, I want its color to be black. Secondly, I want it on the right side of the page. So I want it up there, not on the left side of the page. We'll see why this is good for us in a bit. So I'm going to say float on the right. If I refresh, we can see that now our counter is up to the top right. So pop open this. You can see that our counter is on the top right. It's a bit small, and I don't like that. It may be bad for people who don't really see that much. So I'm going to set the font size. Let's play around. Let's just set it to be large. That makes it small in this case. So let's see. XX large. Let's try that. Okay. So there we go. That's a bit comparable to our previous options. It's still not quite that big, but I suppose it'll do for now. Okay, so that's goal 2 done. Our counter was in a bad position. We've pushed it to the top right, also changed some colors. We can also, You can also look at what's going on with the code, how the web browser looks at your code and how it displays it. When you press Control-Shift-C on Chrome, it's Chrome in this case, I don't remember what it was for Firefox. I think it's also Control-Shift-C. You'll open up the Elements page. So this is also crucial to what you're going to be doing in web development, is when I open up something like this div here, in our counter, we can see it has our options that we put in the CSS file. If I turn this off, it actually gets rid of the option. You can actually modify this stuff dynamically, so you don't have to go into the code and put it in. You can check, okay, is this going to be good in real time? So you don't have to keep on refreshing it each time you change something. Secondly, you have this JavaScript console. I would highly recommend making use. Oh, it's very small. Okay, thank you. That's good to know. So this is just, once again, I'll make note of it. All the style options are here for your respective objects. So div, HTML, body. So the body has the press start 2p font. And if I click on the counter, it has those styles that we specified on the file. Next, we have our JavaScript console. So use this to check things like variables. You can also use it to program in it. We can see that we're currently alive. If I get hit by a bus, And if I check alive now, we're no longer alive. I'd highly make use of this JavaScript console because it's much better than trying to go into your JavaScript file, putting in some code, checking if it runs, and if it doesn't run, then going back in. You can do various things to see if the code is valid just by putting it into here as opposed to your script file. Additionally, it will send any errors to you or warnings. In this case, I have a few warnings because the image I put in is not a power of 2. That's not really concerning. So it's a warning. However, if I do something that is illegal in JavaScript, so for instance, if I do this and I try to do a reassignment of a constant, it will complain. Now, warnings are okay to deal with. Errors, on the other hand, will halt your code at that point, unless you have ways to deal with them. So one thing to do is if you run into an error or your code is white, open up your console. It will tell you why your code isn't working, and it'll give you the line as well. In this case, it's just saying, okay, you've done it from the console. It's not going to report any issues. But if it does have an issue in the file, it will say the line it's on. The other stuff here is not too essential. There is this sort of application stuff, but it's not really too relevant. So this will just be useful in case we run into any errors. Let's go on to the third task. There's an old game called Frogger, and it looks like this. It's basically a top-down 2D perspective CrossyRoad. And it so happens that if I was to change some camera settings, so if I go here, I've actually documented it as well. So this is like the 3D rotation of the camera that it's got on the bird. And if I set this to 030, 0, and I refresh my page, you can see it's a top-down 2D perspective, which is actually pretty cool. So I want to have a button, a switch toggle really, that will change between 3D and this 2D top-down perspective. First off, we need to create a button. Now, there is the button that I showed before, but personally, I like this switch toggle, and it's going to explain some of the CSS we're going to be using. So let's get to that. In here, well, in the CSS file, I've defined some stuff to do with a slider. So we're going to be using a slider toggle. And all of this will play into this cool little toggle here. This comes from the W3 school. So this is another resource I highly recommend using. So it's going to look like that by the end of it. And it also has a tutorial on how you want to use it yourself. So the CSS I've already put into the file, but I just need this, the rectangular switch, although you can also use a rounded switch. So I'm going to take everything in here. This just defines a label and a span. And the input here basically just takes an interaction from the user. And all of that styles on top of it to make that pretty button. Okay, so let's put it into our div. Now, there is a secondary div here on top of this div here. Think of this as like containing two things in a box. So our container is here, and our div is going to be somewhere on the same level as it. If I save and refresh, not this, not. I see this button now. It has no interaction, obviously. So I want to make it switch between regular view and the 2D view. So we need to go back to our JavaScript file. I'm going to set this back to our default. I think it was 50-20-10. Okay, so I'll go down, and where we're going to add the interaction, for the sake of making it easy, we're going to add it right next to our other query selector that adds interactivity for the retry button. So instead, I'm actually going to do the following. Document.querySelector. And now I'm going to do it on something called camera view. You may notice that I haven't defined any object with the camera view setting. So I will do that in a bit, but we'll add the logic first. So I'm going to add an event listener by the name, by interaction for click, and do that weird function thing once again. Okay. I need something else though, because we don't have any information on whether this thing is on or off. I will do the following. I'm going to say let's mode equals chicken. So this is going to be a string. And we're going to say if the mode is chicken, mode is equal to chicken, I want to change it to the Frogger style view. So I'm going to set the mode to be Frogger. And then we'll go back to the top. So we're currently at line 440. Just going to remember that. And I'm going to copy this down and go back to line 440. Now, the spacing here actually doesn't matter. So if you're a Python developer and you're used to having to format the spaces, JavaScript doesn't care. So in this case, I'm going to leave it like this, even though it's a bit messy. I'm going to set the camera and rotations, the camera's rotations to be the new style I showed you before. But now I also want it to revert. So if it's not in the mode of chicken, that is, if it's in the Frogger mode and it doesn't meet this condition, I'm going to reset it back to what it was originally. So I'm going to reset the camera settings. And I'm going to say mode is equal to chicken. And let's try this out. There's always the chance that something might go wrong. And it did go wrong. Lovely. And this is perfect, actually. So we have an error. Why is this? Line 439. We see that this is a line here, and it's a perfect time to demonstrate what you do with errors. Cannot read properties of null. That means whatever happened in here, it returned null. It means that there was no objects with the hash, the tag camera view. And obviously I forgot to add in camera view. So we need to remedy this by putting the ID camera view into our slider. I believe it goes in here, camera view. View, yep. And let's try refreshing. Boom, our code is working again. It's found an element that does match up with the camera view setting. And there we go. We have a way to change our perspective. So we go from 3D to 2D, just like that. And we've added quite a bit of functionality. If you look at the screen, we've added this change of perspective. We have this counter up here. There's so much more you can do, really. And you also hot point, you die, so it doesn't look awkward. We've also made it a bit prettier as well. Now, this is pretty much just the beginning in terms of what you can do with web development. So we'll go back to the stuff I had here. Let's talk about what there is beyond for you. First off, we only use 3 bits of web dev. That is the CSS, the HTML, and JS. There are many components, many frameworks that make what we did a very simple job. First off, React, Angular, Vue. These are some common names you'll hear, and they extend to make very pretty apps. So for instance, Facebook, Instagram, I'm not sure if they use React now, but Facebook developed React, and it's being used in various technologies they use. Produces very pretty apps. It's very big, though, and has a moderate learning curve. Now, if you also want this on the internet, so this is currently on our browser. It's not going to reach anyone on the internet. We need to deploy it somewhere. Very easy solutions include something called Heroku. This is what you call a platform as a service. They will host your website for you so that whenever anyone goes to that URL, and they will see your website pretty much. This is pretty useful for hackathon projects. So if you're thinking of getting into web dev, this is perfect for you. Heroku, Netlify, there's some others that provide free options. One of my own apps is also hosted on there. So just to show you, they use the Heroku app domain. It's going to take a while to load, but in the time it takes, we'll talk about AWS. So you also hear a lot about cloud services. Basically, what happens here is they provide the server hosting options. They provide all sorts of stuff for you to do, and you just have to pay the price for it. So they host the site for you. They do computing for you. And I recommend watching this video on the various services AWS provides. There are other alternatives that are sometimes free, such as hosting it yourself. And there's also the backend. We haven't touched the backend at all. So if I want to do something more complicated, let's say generate images, or maybe save a blog post site. I want to say, check if a user exists. So if someone's creating a user profile, I want to see, okay, does this exist in my database? Of course, you need a database to be there in the first place. The front end usually doesn't interact with databases. So, okay. Yeah, basically the backend handles that sort of data finding. If it needs to check if the user exists, it goes to the database, could be SQL, could be MongoDB, and it will check if it exists. You can also put data into those databases, or perhaps if it needs to run something heavy, like say run something related to artificial intelligence, it will do that and return the results to the front end. Of those, you have these three prominent architectures. You have REST, GraphQL, and gRPC, RPC. They may seem like buzzwords or things that don't really have meaning, but basically, most people will use REST for their applications. This is basically a send-get model where you ask information and you get information back. GraphQL one is a bit more nifty in that you specify the information you want and GraphQL gives you the specific information. And so finally, the extension stuff. How do you put this into action? How do you improve on your skills really? First off, the 3JS library is used for rendering lots of 3D stuff. So I can recommend the following things if you want to keep developing the game. Menu for swapping characters. That will involve finding other models online or designing your own models, and then creating an element that has various characters on it that disappears when you're in the game, but appears when you're on the main menu. That is after you hit the retry button, you haven't moved. And in the original game, there are things like trains that move very fast. You can also add sound. It's not too hard to add. And also animations. So right now, bird just halts if it gets hit. In the actual game, it gets squashed when it dies. Things to try. So make sure you actually try applying this sort of stuff. A lot of this HTML, CSS stuff can be found online. I recommend using W3 School as a reference. There are lots of details here. So for a lot of tags, not every tag, there are details on how to use it. So if I go to INS, tells you what you can put into it, what attributes it has. Same thing for CSS. CSS can get very complicated in terms of how pretty you can make it. There are libraries for handling CSS as well, and JavaScript. One thing I'd recommend doing is participating in hackathons. Even though you may not be necessarily as skilled as the other people participating, you definitely learn a lot in a team environment where other people may be more experienced and can give you knowledge about how to do certain things. You learn a lot of programming just by tinkering around with what you have. So some ideas could include a personal website that holds stuff you've worked on, or perhaps a blog site template, something along the lines of that. Our own Hackathon will actually be running around week 5, week 6. So stay tuned for that. And finally, resources down here. I've added a lot of resources that you can glance over. And really, if you have any questions, I'm not the web dev person on the team. I really specialize in data science, low-level stuff and backend. Feel free to message us on Discord regardless. We're probably active pretty often, and Mac Discord's also pretty active. So make sure to reach out if you're not sure about how something's working and if you have some issue with code. So really, that should have been the slide here, but yeah, thank you for coming, everyone. I'll be taking questions in the last 5 minutes, but feel free to ask questions about anything I've covered today. Okay, thank you. Oh, you probably think this is, oops. I'll do this, I'll put this into the chat. Yep. We fill this out, by the way. It helps us with planning future events because we look at what people submit in these forms and we try to build workshops catered towards what people want. So be sure to submit it. Okay, so the workshop is recorded. We will upload it to our Mac channel in due course. And Mac channel, does someone have a link to it? If someone puts a link down, we have our past workshops recorded on there. Yep, I'll put it down here. There we go. Yep, so most events are recorded with the exception of in-person events. Typically, that's how it goes. Oh, yep, thank you. Also, one thing to clarify. Someone did mention that WebAssembly is actually a back-end thing, a front-end thing. That's just to give you an idea of what WebAssembly is. It basically targets lower level languages like C, Rust, C++, things that aren't designed to be anywhere near the web, and creates basically this in-between language that can be used on the internet. It technically does come on the front end because it gets interpreted by JavaScript. So it should be up here, but I feel like it kind of belongs here as well, because sometimes you can turn apps that have a back end in those languages and turn it into a front end mainly thing by turning it into WebAssembly. Yeah. I believe WebAssembly is pretty cool, by the way. It's a good way of writing code that avoids using JavaScript. So each to their own. Look, everyone has their preferences about what tech stack to use. I'd recommend watching the Fireship video here. That's not the one. Where is it? It's somewhere, wherever it is. But that video does a pretty good job on summarizing what you can put together to make a full web application, wherever it was. Here it is, yes. It's a good video. I recommend this channel as well. Everything web dev, I check this channel out. Oh, yeah, great idea. Control F, yeah. Yeah, I understand legacy code bases with really old C++ code. I probably wouldn't deploy that to WebAssembly. Recommend using something like Rust. It's more modern. It's a bit annoying to learn, but it's very modern, very useful for WebAssembly. All right, that's pretty much time. Whew. If no one has any other questions, thank you once again for coming.